Since I did a couple of episodes on plastic pollution, I wanted to kind of bring it home a little bit because a lot of the times when we think of plastic pollution, we think of ocean plastic pollution, but we never really think about our drinking water or our streams or our lakes. And there's new research to suggest that there is more plastic pollution in our Great Lakes than ever before. And we're going to talk about in today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. And this is a podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. And today we're going to be going over how you can speak up for the ocean by looking at some new research about plastic pollution in lakes, especially around city centers like Chicago and Toronto here in Canada. This is something that I always find interesting. When we think of plastic pollution, a lot of times when we discuss it, we talk about ocean plastic pollution. Ocean plastic pollution is found everywhere, as we always mention. But when we really see the videos of plastic pollution, a lot of times we're thinking and we're seeing videos of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the Pacific Gyre. We're seeing rivers and streams and coastlines in small island states, Indonesia, Malaysia, places like that, Thailand. When we see places where maybe the waste management isn't expected to be as developed, but when we talk about it, when we really think about it, there is plastic pollution everywhere. There's research to suggest that there's plastic pollution even in air molecules. There are plastic pollution, the microplastics when we talk about that. There's plastic pollution in our drinking water when we look at water from, plastic water bottles. Especially when you start to think about how you have to take off the cap, there's little particles that end up in the drinking water, in the water of your bottle, and then so you're drinking that in. And we know the effects are harmful on humans long term about, when we talk about ingesting microplastics and plastic pollution. I'm not talking about like swallowing a lighter like we see in birds, the seabirds and so forth. What I'm talking about is little particles that are attached to our foods, little particles that are attached to air molecules, little particles that are attached to water molecules that enter our body, and over time we build that up. We build it up in our system, and those chemicals leach into our bodies, leach into our bloodstream, and eventually it can affect our health in a negative way, obviously. And I think what happens is it's not just that we see plastic pollution in the ocean. We see plastic pollution in our Great Lakes, in our streams, in tributaries, especially around city centers like Chicago in the U.S. and Toronto in Canada, where I live. And The Guardian reported on a recent peer-reviewed paper from the University of Toronto, which is just down the road from me, that found that nearly 90% of water samples taken from the Great Lakes over the last 10 years contain levels of microplastics unsafe for wildlife. Think about that. 90% of the samples taken. You're probably looking at hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of samples over 10 years, because there's a lot of water quality work that goes on within the Great Lakes. It says here, our planet is riddled with plastic pollution. Plastics take ages to break down. As they do, they create microplastics, tiny particles that that are less than 5 millimeters, or about 0.2 inches in length. Of the samples taken and analyzed from the Great Lakes, about 20% are at the highest level of risk. And 90% is a lot. Eden Hatley, the University of Toronto researcher and co-author of the study, said, we need to answer some basic questions by monitoring so we can quantify risks to wildlife and humans. So we're not only just looking at wildlife here, we're looking at human health as well. So it's a really interesting article, and I'm going to post it on the I'll post a link of the article on the web on the show notes, not on the website, on the show notes, which will be on the website speakupforblue.com/podcast. But it's really interesting to see how it's explained here. And when we talk about it, it says Statista reported that about 40 million tons of plastics are thrown out annually in the United States alone. Only about 5% of this gets recycled, as per Greenpeace, and about 85% ends up in landfills. Researchers found that 22 million pounds of plastic debris enter the Great Lakes every year from the US and Canada. That's as much weight as in plastic as about 5,500 cars. Think about that. Imagine 5,500 cars in the Great Lakes. That would be an epidemic. That would be a problem. That people would not like that. But we just don't see that every day. We don't see the fact that it's that amount of weight. That's how many plastic particles are in the Great Lakes. This is something that's a problem. So how do we get there? So it says Hadley, which is the researcher, believes wastewater treatment plants, microfibers that come off clothing in washing machines, and pre-production plastic pellets used in manufacturing are major contributors of plastics in the Great Lakes Basin. She also noted that alarming levels of microplastics have been found in fish consumed by humans and beer brewed with water from the Great Lakes. We have a lot of microbreweries around the Great Lakes on the US side as well as on the Canadian side, and they use water from the Great Lakes. So this is obviously a concerning thing if you're a beer drinker and you like your alcohol. Obviously you have to, consuming in moderation, but now we have plastics involved. It becomes a lot harder to be able to manage. So these are things that we have to be concerned about going forward, but what can we do about it? Well, the first thing the authors say that we can do about it is governments can start putting up monitoring protocols and setting up monitoring programs that monitor microplastics levels in the Great Lakes and in our tributaries now. So you got to remember, Great Lakes is a huge source of drinking water, not only for now, but in the future as well. These are things that we need to be concerned about. It's 20% of the world's fresh water is in the Great Lakes. This is something that we've been proud of as Ontarians, as Canadians, as Americans. This is something that we need to make sure that we keep healthy. We've already had water quality problems before with algae and metals getting in. We've done a decent job at cleaning that up. We're still working on the algae thing. Climate change isn't helping. However, we are progressing because we're monitoring it. We are getting data on it. We're seeing if it's increasing or decreasing and what is necessary to ensure that the increase or decrease is managed properly. So having those monitoring programs and monitoring protocols set up is going to be extremely important. And what's also nice, though, is we already have policies that look after Great Lakes water quality. And it's called the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. It's something that I had the pleasure of working on when I worked for DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in the Great Lakes, as well as I worked for Environment Canada. And so we worked on this. It's a binational agreement that the US and Canada take part in. And we look at how to set up monitoring protocols and monitoring programs on both sides of the border to be able to monitor water quality. And there are a number of criteria that we are looking at. And to be able to add microplastics on there wouldn't be that difficult because the system's already set up. People are already meeting. You have no idea how many different government departments on the US and Canadian side meet together, as well as academics, as well as nonprofit organizations, to discuss how to manage the Great Lakes water quality. And having this Great Lakes water quality agreement is extremely important to the future of our Great Lakes. Adding microplastics would allow that program to happen and money to flow through that. There's already a system that allows money and that will provide organizations and government departments to be able to take advantage of monitoring these microplastics. So it's always great. Now, on top of that, manufacturers can get involved by adding filters to washing machines or storm sewers at manufacturing sites. That would also greatly help, the researcher told the Guardian, which is who posted this article at the beginning or originally. And just as individuals, we can research ways to reduce our reliance on single-use plastics and take steps to do so. It's already helpful. I mentioned earlier in Canada, we have policies and regulations to start to stamp out single-use plastics. It's not perfect right now, but it's a start, and we're moving towards getting more and more restrictive with plastics as we allow businesses to adapt to serving single-use plastics or providing, food and other things in single-use plastic containers. So obviously that's great. So she says the timeline is not shocking, but it makes a lot of sense to do it now. So in other words, we can do this quickly, but we need to start, or else we're going to be in trouble. This can it's already gotten away from us quite a bit, but we're still able to help and reduce the amount of pollution that goes into our oceans. This is something that is definitely doable. That's one thing I like when we start talking about plastic pollution. There's an easy call to action to help people. The first, I always say, and I tell this to my daughters, they love Starbucks. The kids their age, from 14 to 16 or even 11 to 19, love Starbucks, and probably in your 20s too. You love Starbucks. You love going to a coffee shop, whether it's Starbucks or other places. Starbucks is a little notorious for serving everything in plastic containers, but they actually have programs in most of the stores where you can go in and you can provide your refillable water bottle or refillable container and say, hey, can you put coffee in here? I want a grande or whatever you call it. I don't drink coffee and I don't go to Starbucks, but that's, you can ask for your drink in a refillable cup, and they should be able to provide that to you. If they don't, you should be contacting Starbucks and asking them why they don't provide that, because they used to, and I believe they still do. I know they still do here in Burlington. And I'm always telling people, it's like, if you just have it with you, most people will have, water bottles with you. Because you bring water everywhere. So if you want to have a coffee or you want to have a special drink from your favorite coffee place, then bring it with you and just ask. Be like, hey, can you put it in this? I want it to remain colder. I'm looking out for the environment. I would really like to do that. It may not be part of their policy yet, but the more people that ask, the more they'll start to think about, hey, we can actually do this in these policies. And I think it's important that we start to ask. These are like the first couple of things that you can do to really help in terms of, lessening your single-use plastic. The other thing is refuse plastic bags, refuse plastic containers. If you can, refuse plastic cutlery. Use cutlery that you bring from home. It's not hard to have it in your bag. Actually, there are manufacturers out there. There are places where you can buy cutlery that just kind of fold up and go into your purse or into your pocket or maybe into your car that you can keep it in. And it's really handy to have those where you don't have to worry about taking plastic utensils. These are just little things that you can do on your own. Now, with that said, there are a lot of things that we can do on our own, and you can take it step by step if that's what you feel comfortable with. It's never going to be perfect, but you can always improve. But also, we do need government policies. And earlier this week, we talked about plastic pollution. We talked about with Margaret Spring, and we talked about the UN Treaty to End Plastic Pollution. So when you have the UN Treaty to End Plastic Pollution, that's going to help governments to really put in policies and agree towards promising policies that will end plastic pollution in their country. There are a number of countries that have already signed up, and that's putting those treaties, although they're not completely binding, or they should be, it's more of if you're not doing it, you kind of get shamed in the fact that you're not doing it. And so that helps people, the countries to be able to put more pressure on it. Plus, other opponents of the political parties that want to be in power can kind of call them out on that. It's like, you signed this treaty, but you didn't fulfill your promise. Why is it? Why did you do that? I would do that if I were prime minister or president or head of state or whatever that might be. So there are different ways that, ways that we can implement policies, even as an individual or as a government, and making sure your government does that and it can work. It can work. And this UN treaty is supposed to be finished by 2025, which is fairly quick when you talk about UN treaties and UN anything or government anything. That's a lot to be done. Some countries are already doing that. Like I mentioned, Canada's doing that. The US is creating their national policy on plastic pollution as the UN treaty is being created. So hopefully they'll have theirs done within the year, maybe even less. So we're seeing progress being made, and that's a hopeful thing. And when we decrease the dependence on single-use plastics, we also decrease the dependence on oil and gas and petroleum products, because that's what plastic pollution is, or that's what plastics are. They're a petroleum product. So the more we divest from that, the more we divest from fossil fuels, and that is really special. So that's it for today's episode. Love to hear your thoughts on this, plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. If you live around the Great Lakes, you're concerned about that, please feel free to reach out to me. You can do that in many ways. One of those is DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. how to protect the ocean, all one word. And then you can also contact me through my website, speakupforblue.com. All you have to do is just go to the Contact Us page, fill out the form. That goes straight to my personal email. And then you can also go to the website. At the bottom right corner, there's a microphone. Leave a voicemail if you want me to hear your voice. I always love it that way. Get to know you a little bit more. And that's it for today's episode. I want to thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.